So I'm going to start by reading this short passage from 1 Peter. That's out of the NIV. It's up on the screen there if you want to follow along. The end of all things is near. Therefore, be alert and of sober mind so that you may pray. Above all, love each other deeply because love covers over a multitude of sins. Offer hospitality to one another without grumbling. Each of you should use whatever gift you have received to serve others as faithful stewards of God's grace in its various forms. If anyone speaks, they should do so as one who speaks the very words of God. If anyone serves, they should do so with the strength God provides, so that in all things God may be praised through Jesus Christ. To him be all the glory and the power forever and ever. Amen. All right. So I did a bit of a survey as I was preparing this message, and I asked people what the first thing that came to mind was when they heard the word hospitality. And the responses were mostly around this idea of inviting people into your home, welcoming people in, sharing meals together. And I was really encouraged to hear that, because there was this overarching sense that hospitality was more than just sort of entertaining. In the relatively short period of time that Roseanne, Georgia, and myself have been part of the community here, we have experienced some incredible hospitality. A number of you have invited us into your homes, and we've had a meal together. That's been lovely. So I want to thank you for that. There's something significant about sharing a meal together with someone, isn't there? And I want to clarify, it doesn't have to be a dinner party. It can be as simple as stopping by Coles or Woolworths and picking up a barbecue chicken and a bag of salad. So when I talk about having a meal together, I'm not talking about doing a big dinner party together or anything like that. So before we go any further, I just want to really encourage you as a church to keep doing this, because it's been a real blessing to us. So thank you. All right, I want you to have a quick look around and see who's sitting nearby you. Don't look too long and make it feel awkward for anyone. Maybe it's someone, as you look around, maybe you see someone that you know really well, and you've had them in your home many times. You know them really well. Might be someone from you're in a connect group, a small group Bible study together, or KYB or something like that, and you know them really well. Or maybe you look around and you see someone that you know from church. You sort of know who they are, but you don't really know them all that well. You've said hello to them, but that's sort of about the extent of it. Or maybe you looked around and you saw someone and you thought, I'm not sure if I know that person. Maybe they're relatively new, or they've only been coming a short period of time. Or maybe it's you that's fairly new to this church, and as you look around, there's really no one that you see that you know very well, and you're hoping that this will turn out to be a hospitable church and that people will show you the sort of hospitality that's been shown to myself and my family. Or maybe when you looked around, you noticed someone and you thought, there's such and such. They are really hospitable, but it's okay for them because they've got the ideal home for entertaining. Or it's all right for them because they are a really good cook. Or maybe you just looked around and you thought, man, I'd be embarrassed to have anyone in my house. Regardless of who you saw when you looked around, I'm sure you'll agree that hospitality is a really important part of any church community. Hospitality, it's not just something that's important to church communities like us. It's a significant part of the culture that we live in, to the point where we've built an entire industry around hospitality. You can go down to the TAFE course in town and enroll in a hospitality training course. Some of you work in the hospitality industry. Some of you know people who do. I looked up a definition of the hospitality industry to see if that might be helpful, and I found this. The hospitality industry refers to a variety of businesses and services linked to leisure and customer satisfaction. A defining aspect of the hospitality industry is also the fact that it focuses on ideas of luxury, pleasure, enjoyment, and experiences, as opposed to catering for necessities and essentials. All right, so if we were to go by that definition, it'd be looking a bit like hospitality it's kind of a nice thing to experience. I mean, it focuses on luxury, pleasure, enjoyment, experience. Sounds pretty awesome, but maybe it's not really such an essential thing, right? I mean, how important is it really? If we were to look at all the themes spoken of throughout the Bible, where would you rank hospitality? Amongst things like salvation, prayer, consequences of sin, God's righteousness, faith, obedience, God's sovereignty, all those things, where would you rank hospitality? If you were to rank them in order, top 5, maybe top 10? What if I was to say this morning that hospitality is one of the very key themes of the entire Bible? Now, that might sound like a bit of a stretch, but I want you to stay with me. What if I told you that the true meaning of what Peter was getting at was something far, far deeper than that definition that I just read out? And it was far deeper than just being friendly and welcoming to other people from the church community here. You got to remember, the book of First Peter was originally written in Greek, and then it was translated into English. So what was the original word that was used? The word that we have translated into hospitality is the word philoxenia. And it literally means a lover of strangers or a lover of the foreigner. And this word wasn't referring so much to other people from within your own tribe or social network, or in our case, the people from within our church that we don't know very well. It was referring more to people from outside the community. Throughout the Bible, the term stranger or alien referred to someone who was an outsider, someone who had little or maybe even no rights, someone who had no permanent home, no statehood, no citizenship. So more than likely, it was someone who had very different beliefs or had a very different worldview to yourself. In biblical times, back when this was written, if you had to travel anywhere outside of your immediate homeland, unless you're a really, really important person or royalty, you'd be relying on the kindness of strangers to have all of your needs met. It wasn't like if someone has to come to Dubbo for work. I looked it up. There's 103 hotels and motels in Dubbo that they could choose to stay at, plus probably countless dozens of B&Bs and all sorts of things. It wasn't like that. People had to rely on other people. There's a guy named Rodney Duke, and he's a biblical historian, and he says this: in the absence of a professional hospitality industry, the survival of the traveller really did depend upon the kindness of strangers. The plight of aliens was desperate. They lacked membership in the community, be it tribe, city, state, or nation, and as an alienated person, the traveller often needed immediate food and lodging. Widows, orphans, the poor, and sojourners from other lands lacked the familial or community status that provided a landed inheritance, the means of making a living, and protection. In the ancient world, the practice of hospitality meant graciously receiving an alienated person into one's land, home, or community and providing directly for that person's need. Are you starting to get an idea of what Peter was talking about in that passage? There's another New Testament word that's translated as hospitality in the New Testament, and that is the word xenodoceo. And it's made up of two different words. It's a compound of the word xenos, which is probably not an unfamiliar sounding word to you, and that means stranger or foreigner. Or specifically the way it was used here, someone without the knowledge of or without a share in. And the second part of the word is decamai, which means to receive and accept, or it's used in the New Testament to mean take with the hand, give ear to, embrace, and sometimes even to receive into one's family, to bring up or educate. So if we were to take all those sort of biblical definitions of that word hospitality, we could come up with our own definition, which is a bit wordy, but consider this. Hospitality then extends even to taking by the hand and embracing into one's family the stranger who has no share in or knowledge of one's own identity, life, and values. That's a biblical definition. Now, it's a bit formal, I know, but the overarching sense here is that that's a real, genuine love and concern for strangers, for outsiders, people who don't share the same values as you, people who don't perhaps have the same beliefs as you. Now, if you've been around this church for any length of time, you'll have heard us talking about three things that are really important to us: being kingdom-focused, relational, and spirit-led. I want you to keep those three things at the forefront of your mind this morning, and you might come to the same conclusion that I did, and that's biblical hospitality can be a powerful expression of those three values to the world around us. All right, so here in central New South Wales, who might be the strangers nowadays, the ones currently alienated from us? Queenslanders?
That's one exception of that.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah. It might be a Queenslander. That would be very challenging for me, I know, but yeah, absolutely. Someone yet to know Christ.
Muslims.
Beautiful. Muslims. Yeah, I had a note here. It might be the Muslim family that lived down the street from you, or it might be the single family. The single mum who has no family support, or it might be the gay couple that live near you, or the newly arrived refugees who don't speak much English, the homeless woman that you drive past on the way home, or walk past at Aldi when you go there. Or it might be that guy at work that always seems to have the polar opposite view as yourself. Could be anyone. All right, so with that in mind, I want to just have one more definition here, and it's from a guy, Professor David Gushee. This is the biblical meaning of hospitality: making room for the stranger, especially those in most acute need. Such care must not be reduced to mere social entertaining, nor may it be self-interested and reciprocal. Instead, biblical hospitality reaches out to the abject and lowly and expects nothing in return. Hospitality is not optional, nor should it be understood as a rare spiritual gift. Instead, it is a normal biblical practice that is learned by doing it. Are you starting to get a sense of what hospitality in the biblical sense is? It's not always easy. It won't always be a pleasant Sunday afternoon eating barbecue chicken with a family from church. When I was preparing this, Roseanne reminded me of a situation that happened. I'd forgotten about it, and you'll see in a minute why Roseanne has always remembered this. It was back when I was a youth pastor in Canada, and I came home really late one Thursday night from youth group, and I woke Roseanne up saying, "I've brought a guy home, young guy. I've invited him to stay with us for a few days. He's been kicked out of his home." And then I had to tell her that I had to take some knives off him before I let him into my home with my wife and kids. And I had to take every sharp knife out of the kitchen drawers. if we're going to extend biblical hospitality, there's potentially going to be some risks. There'll be inconvenience, there'll be sacrifice, and it won't always be enjoyable. So why on earth would we put ourselves out? Well, I said earlier that this is one of the strongest themes in the Bible. It is actually the central theme of the Bible. What do I mean by that? Excuse me. Well, so far we've considered what this means in terms of ourselves. This question, could I accept into my home someone who doesn't share in or even know any of my identity, life, and values? And that's a valid question, but it's not where we should start. Instead, we need to ask the question, how did God extend hospitality to me? And when we approach things from this angle, we quickly see that God's accepted us into his home, an entire planet full of people who didn't share in or acknowledge his identity, life, and values. He set the example of what it means to welcome and love the stranger. And that's exactly what God does for us as a whole and as individuals every moment of every day. Jehovah Jireh. It's more than a cheesy song we used to sing in the 1980s. It means the Lord will provide. God is always providing for us, all of us. You might be thinking, well, hang on, Ian, I'm no longer a stranger. I'm God calls me an heir, his son, his daughter. And that's true, but I want you to remember a couple of things. God reached out to you first, providing for you and extending hospitality before you responded to him. There's a verse, I'm sure you'll be familiar with it. It's very well known, Romans 5:8. But God demonstrated his love for us in this. While we were still sinners, Christ died for us. And secondly, he's extended that provision to everyone, regardless. The Bible is saturated with with references to God's hospitality and provision that extends to the entire human race. Excuse me, mate. Sorry. That begins in Genesis chapter 1, where God provides food and shelter and companionship to Adam and Eve. And it runs right through the scriptures, story after story of God providing for us humans and sustaining us. One of the countless examples that I found was Psalm 104. This is beautiful. You send rain on the mountains from your heavenly home, and you fill the earth with the fruit of your labor. You cause grass to grow for the livestock and plants for people to use. You allow them to produce food from the earth, wine to make them glad, olive oil to soothe their skin, and bread to give them strength. And what's the story that's woven right through the Old Testament? Is God extending hospitality to the most alienated people of all, the Israelites, and then through them extending his hospitality to all people. Think about all the times we read about God extending and providing for the alienated Israelite people. He redeemed them from Egypt. He fed and clothed them in the wilderness. He guided them into a land that they could call their own. And now God does the same for all people, whether we think they deserve it or not. Matthew 5:43. You've heard it said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, that you may be the children of your Father in heaven. He causes his sun to rise on the evil and the good and sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. Now, there's a bit of an aside. I've got to be honest and say for a long, long time, I misinterpreted the second part of that passage. Right well into my adult life, I thought that was saying God sends positive things for the good and the bad people, and God sends the negative things to the good and the bad people. Now, that is completely wrong. And you probably think, well, yeah, Ian, you city slicker, the rain's a good thing. It's not just semantics. As you all know, in central New South Wales, the two things you need to sustain life is sun and rain. What it means is that God sends good things for the good and the bad people, and God sends good things for the righteous and the unrighteous. Now, that was a major shift for me, I have to tell you. Maybe that's how you've interpreted it, but it was probably just me, I'm going to guess. When Jesus said this, he was telling his audience to extend love and care to everyone in the same way his Heavenly Father had already been doing for all of mankind. Now, don't we just love it when we see good things happening to undeserving people? I don't need a show of hands, but does anyone else get a bit frustrated when they see good things happening to people that we don't, believe they deserve? So we can fall into the trap pretty easily of thinking God should send good things to the good people and bad things to the bad. And if you've noticed, we always tend to place ourselves in the good side of that argument, don't we? Excuse me, sorry for the coughing. But that is not the nature of God. God's always been a gracious host. Jehovah Jireh, he provides for all his guests, even the badly behaved ones. We need to remember that God pours out his hospitality on all people. So when we see good things happening to bad people, may it just be a reminder to us of the wonder of God, the love of God, the grace of God. And so don't stress over them. Just look at that situation and be reminded and think, man, how amazingly good is our God. All right, so let's wrap this up. I'd like to think that at the end of every sermon, we're challenged to some kind of action, challenged to grow or mature in some way. It might be a challenge to change our thinking or change our understanding of God, or maybe deepen our love for God and fellow man. This is a more practical call to action. And then, maybe a practical response will then foster a change of heart and a deepening of love for others. Because let's face it, putting the needs of strangers ahead of our own is not a natural response for most of us. Roseanne gave me permission to share this. When she was young, she would spend almost every Sunday afternoon at her best friend's house in Wahroonga in the North Shore of Sydney. She'd go home with them after church, spend the afternoon there, and then her parents would come and pick her up in the afternoon. And she said that almost every week this family would have someone different for lunch. It might have been people from church, but it was just as likely to be colleagues from work or just someone who needed a meal and some company. And yet Roseanne literally can't remember anyone ever coming to her house for a meal. Even her best friend was never allowed to come. So Roseanne had these two models that she grew up with. And she said that when she got married and she had her own place, that she wanted to take the lead of this second family, the other family, and not follow the example that she had from her own family. If this stuff is new to you, maybe you could start by inviting someone into your home once a month or even every 6 weeks. And if your own house is not feasible, go and buy your barbecue chicken and your bag of salad and go to the Japanese gardens or somewhere like that. There's lots of beautiful spots around. It doesn't have to be in your own home if that's not feasible. If this is something that you're already doing, maybe take some cues from some very close friends of ours in Canada, and they've always committed to spending 2 meals every week with someone from outside of their family. We can remember them always having neighbours in their family or people who were travelling through town, people who needed somewhere to stay for a night or two. There was always someone in there. And I want to remind you too that hospitality is not necessarily about changing people. That's not what it's about. It's about creating a space where change can occur. Can you see the difference? A place where a stranger can become a friend instead of an enemy. But even more than taking cues from these people, may you follow the example that God has set before the dawn of time, extending his provision, his love, his grace, his hospitality to every single one of us. I hand it over to you, Alan, or to close in prayer. Thanks.